14. The Siege of Surgirkar. The northern and southern dredges were muddy moats which, in days free of threat, sat sun-baked and marshy, muck-cracked like the scales of some vast serpent at the feet of the outer and southern walls, linking the Igtuku to the Usal, both above and below the city. But the storm summoned up from the sea had fattened the rivers with Laut's tears from black cloud and cruel wind, and the dredges had swelled alongside them. The Igtuku and Usal were soon twice their prior width, and the green foliage along the banks of the rivers was lost beneath muddied currents. The canals within the city, deeply carved for just such times of flood and defense, were now near to overflowing. Channels cut to drain compound courtyards spouted water into roaring gutters across Surgirkar, and the outer fields on the city's northern fringe had grown thick and soupy with mud. And as the scouts had predicted, the thunder of that storm was joined the very night after the arrival of aid from Lautani by a distant rumble of enemy batteries as the cannon-borne voice of the Lord of War competed with the roars of Laut's gale. The main force of their guns had been ported across the Igtuku far north of the city, and were now emplaced more than 10 miles from the northernmost outer wall between the rivers. Several mammoth specimens ordered as prototypes from Tepeklan were closer to 30 miles off, and while it would be many months before such Titan siege guns replaced their smaller cousins, their presence spoke to the Empire's commitment to the final success at Surgirkar. It was a well-chosen position, that northern span, one many of the Royal Guard had guessed the Shaishans might occupy. It placed them as far away as was possible from the Port Solar in the city's heart, where the heavy guns of Lautani dreadnoughts might reach back to claw hungrily at them. Their prime target was that very northern wall, the one along which the Lautani Marines had requested to be garrisoned. Here, the military minds of the Ugg knew, the foe would carve a breach much like the ones which had spelled the doom of the first 2 of Gunug's great walls, and in time launch a push into the outer fields, from which they would breach the upper city. And yet the dogged sons of Harakwe were not immune to pain simply because the Port Solar was out of reach. For one, the naval guns unloaded from cargo vessels and pulled by Lautani elephant teams out to the northern defenses had, at their largest, ranges of nearly 20 miles. They were not, of course, true artillery, as compared with the siege guns arrayed against them, but the Shaishans were attempting to breach walls, and the cumbersome, many-layered shells they hurled had been forged for this purpose. The Ugg and Lautani merely needed to mangle cannon, and the naval pieces served that purpose just fine. Secondly, the Pamechadunia, boasting 36 of the largest and most well-honed main guns Lautani could craft in her great shipyards and foundries in chittering and smog-shrouded Besipalabuhan, had a range of fully 36 miles with this main armament. While the other dreadnoughts sat smoking and brooding in the night, the flagship was hurling fire back at the foe. And while this was guesswork, and the impact of it could not rightly be known until dawn, the volcanic fury of the greatest warship the world had ever seen did much to hearten those few souls who braved the streets of Surgirkar that terrible night to see it. And what dark sights those intrepid few saw! For though the focus of Shaidi was the northern wall, the new 30-milers from Tepeklan were aiming for the belly of their chosen prey. Though the azure city of Surgirkar was dark as midnight hill country beneath the blackened sky, its soft innards rippled here and there with the dull, sudden glow of impact as heavy shells tore through roofs or pulped ancient walls, first in one quarter, then in another. That first night, the Shaishans were, much like the Lautani, probing, prodding blind in the vast sprawl of street and alley, and sowing what terror they could there. The dawn, though, would begin the air war, and with it, the seeking shells of both sides would become much more deadly. It was the 8th of Nehuelio, the second morning after arrival. The Lautani had many thousands of craft and trained pilots of the Navy, which, in those early days, still governed their air wings, on hand. The lanes around the Port Solar, along with the larger of the docks, were being used to launch them. Though the wind and rain had kept all craft grounded the night prior, that morning was gray with the thinning of cloud, and the driving, unnatural rain had slowed to a steady hum to replace what had up to that point been a persistent roar. And though still stray gust or unpredictable current posed threat to pilots braving the weather, there was little choice for both defender and attacker but to go and to hope. While the majority of these Lautani craft were flimsy canvas-winged monoplanes, 1,000 of their proper fighters, sleek biplanes more than capable of fulfilling roles both as scout spotters and combat craft, were also on the move. They outnumbered the enemy quite handily now that the new arrivals from the Isles had been mobilized in the city, and the shrill whine and shaky outline of them skirting the rain-dark clouds became a constant presence over Sirgirkar. The sleekly organized rotation of planes on and off the impromptu runways near the port meant downtimes were minimal, as one wing would come in for refueling, report, and repair, just as another would roll out in its wake. But the Sholoshaishans, even if outnumbered, were more than capable of posing a threat to the cheaply built monoplane fodder, so far as they saw it, thrown forth by their foes. For they had at their disposal the sons of the Aldakan, from Volvenreich, away in the New World, and it was they who had birthed flying by balloon and airship and glider many centuries ago. While the Volvin had been slow to take to engine and machine lent them by their Sholoshaishan protectors, when eventually they had turned their minds to such things, the wolf folk had proved cunning indeed, more than a match for their Sholoshaishan or Lautani counterparts in the race to bring flight into the new century. The biplanes and triplanes of the Empire, therefore, though often assembled in factories scattered across new or old Sholoshaidi, were designed by other minds. As such, in the early years of the new century, Volvin pilots had often manned most of Sholoshaidi's aircraft, renowned not just for their reflexes and keen pace of decision, but also for their fearlessness of heights and speed, a rarity among the once subterranean Sholoshaishans. They made great pilots. Most had returned to their Volvenreich by skyship upon the outbreak of war, to defend their own skies in the New World, but the expertise they had lent their Sholoshaishan trainees remained. The complement of the armored zeppelins the Sholoshaishans had termed sky fortresses were now the sole craft piloted by Volvin. The rest were in the hands of Shaishan pilots, and despite their being outnumbered, the experience they had garnered over the fields of eastern Gunug proved invaluable in evening the odds. The sky fortresses were difficult to shoot down for the Lautani at the best of times, but their capacity for altitude made them impossible to assault if they maintained their greatest operational height. Thus, the Zeppelins of Volvenreich became a common sight over Sirgirkar in the days which followed, distant shapes against the dark clouds, or else half-glimpsed silhouettes of deepened murk in the haze. For the most part, these craft were attempting to sight where Sholoshaishan shells were landing, and then signal corrections if the bombardments were off the mark. It was by their direction that more than 10 of the dreadnoughts in the Port Solar were sunk in the second and third day, and the palace atop the hallowed ziggurat of the sun was leveled on the fourth. The Zeppelins would come prowling down out of the gray just long enough to sight, with wings of Sholoshaishan biplanes coming in from the east over the walls to defend them, only to then disappear into the clouds after their task was done. Crude firebombs were dropped by both the Zeppelins and heavy Sholoshaishan triplanes, but given there was little exposed wood in the city, the fires which took were rare. The artillery was the real worry, so far as damage was concerned. But that fact did little to diminish the nervous dread the enemy's capacity to strike inside the walls had raised up in the citizenry. If a shelter were breached, or a home toppled atop a cellar where families huddled away from the quaking of heavy rounds, and scattered survivors crept out to be waved fast into neighboring pits by the ghost patrols of Royal Guard, still out on the streets amidst the chaos, their eyes were ever upward, locked upon a sky which had become hostile and treacherous. The pillar of dawn was dim, even in the day, and far more of their sputtering blue planes were crashing to ruin in the pockmarked avenues of Sirgirkar than the raucous yellow or orange-painted fighters of the enemy. But it would be wrong to say the Sholoshaishans were the sole beneficiaries of the air war, for the heavy Lautani-lent guns along the northern wall closest to the sieging Imperial artillery had stricken dead 2 of the 3 prototype 30-miler cannons the foe had been using to pound the Port Solar, all thanks to hard-fought scouting probes by the pilots of Lautan meant to place eyes on the gun emplacements. The 3rd and final prototype was ferried away elsewhere on the 4th day, it seemed, as the Sholoshaishans sought to preserve it for some greater struggle to come. The Ug Army and Lautani Marine divisions on that northernmost outer wall line could not, of course, see the destruction wrought by the guns of their fortress, but still, they took solace in the fact that they could strike back as the city was ravaged by air. The outer wall, the Marines had learned, was the name the Ug had given to the northernmost section of the city's defenses. Its length was just under 30 miles between a narrow press of the rivers Usal and Igtuku, and along that width it was punctuated by 5 great fortresses, from which the artillery and naval guns could fire. Initially, Berani and his section, along with all the men of Lautan, had been centered along the outer wall, headquartered in Fort Esh, or Fort 3. But Fort 3 had, it was obvious, been singled out for the Sholoshaishan breach, and given the heaviness of the enemy's opening bombardment there during the night of the 7th, all men and guns in Fort Esh, save a skeletal crew, had been rushed out. Now, they were positioned along the walls near Fort Limu, the 4th fort. From here, they, along with the Ug closer to Fort Min, the 2nd fort, would be in a prime position to respond when the eventual assault on the breach was launched. Their proximity would grant them the privilege of being first into the fight, and yet that proximity also meant their heads rang with the rumbling report of each shell landing just a mile or 2 west of them along the line. Berani's soups and drinks rippled with the subtle concussions of percussive blasts each morning or evening when he settled in to dine, and his sleep in the crowded, stinking bunkhouses, on those rare occasions when he found it, had become troubled and fitful. The section, being infantry in good standing, spent the first week of bombardment in the bunkhouses, behind the outer wall. But Berani fast realized, mostly due to increased spats amongst his own men and the men of other sections, that being cooped up in stone boxes all day was not amenable to peace or rest among the Marines. And so he had lobbied Lieutenant Satria to make sure their platoon was moved out onto the wall's firing lines as soon as was possible. For once, Satria, even if he did credit himself with the idea, buckled under pressure from corporals below him. By the grim, cloud-drowned morning of the 14th of Nwelyol, Berani and his men found themselves on the second of 3 stacked firing lines built into the walls. From here, they were able to look through the narrow firing slats out over the mud and grimy swamp of the northern dredge, and onto the dour, half-flooded plain beyond. Their shift on watch, running from early afternoon to midnight, gave them ample taste of both strangled daylight and inky night. Then they retired back to the bunkhouse to sleep. Drinking, if bitter beer rations to which the desperate drinkers among the Lautani had to adapt remained to them, was usually done in the morning, well before the watch kicked off. In the beginning, they kept low unless a noise, some stray shell landing particularly close, or some phantom scream of beast out on the plains, drew their attention. But the Shaishans knew their business, and their devastating fire was precise and targeted, leaving their section of the wall with little to worry over. And so, in time, they began to lean up along the firing windows and watch the land out north, if only so they could have something other than each other to look at. When the second week of bombardment came, they lobbied to be kept on the firing lines and were moved up a floor to the deep-roofed top of the wall. This proved quite good for the spirits of the Marines. Out in the north towards the Sholo-Shaishan batteries, they occasionally saw their own blue scout planes fighting off Sholo-Shaishan pursuers as they came back from the lines, or else could glimpse in the dark of nightfall the far-off flashes of the shells sent north to batter enemy guns. The planes especially raised their ire, and betting cigarettes on the outcome of dogfights became commonplace. Smoking was now ubiquitous. The Ug, to the great delight of Marak, who had been low on cigarettes since the trip north to Gunug had begun, issued their own troops ample supply of cigarettes, and these rations were offered to the Marines along with their weekly loads of food and drink. Berani, who had initially disliked the smell and taste of the foreign plant, was by that second week on watch just as inured to their sensations as any of the others. It was the sleeplessness which had broken him down, the artillery's thumping in his own frayed nerves, always firing as if attack were imminent, had rendered him a slow and exhausted sleepwalker. The nip of nicotine widened his eyes and livened the dull synapses in his skull, keeping at bay some of the weary sluggishness which seemed to have seeped so deep into his tired bones. It was around sundown on the 24th, Berani's third sundown on that highest firing line. He'd just lit his first cigarette of the evening. He found he liked to save them till dark. The sunset itself off west was not visible from his northward window, but from up here at the highest defensible point on the wall, about 50 feet from the ground, the vista of swampy floodplain below was painted a vivid panoply of fiery color, and it soothed his tired eyes to gaze out over the still muddy water made paradoxically lovely by the hour, as he attempted to ignore the distant roar which always filled his ears. Many of the others were lazing about farther off. Marak and Dimas had pulled Pahala, generally a shadow to Berani, into a talk about fishing, all trying to conspire a way to get a line long enough it would reach down into the soup of the flooded dredge below, where the shapes of displaced river fish could often be glimpsed stalking the surface for errant mosquito or gnat. Jabat and Darmang were debating Jorok and Gadin in a 2 versus 2 joust over which city, Sirgirkar or Besipalabuhan, was home to more people. Other sections were equally languid and restful to east or west. Occasionally, a man from another unit would walk down the corridor of the firing line behind, offering trades of beer or strange Ug beet liquor for smokes, and Berani did not intervene to uphold the ban of online drinking when Quiet Agama got a canteen full of red firewater to keep him calm during the silence of the long night. Rifles were slung up against the wall, or else laid flat along the base, the night being as hushed and still as it could be just a mile or two off from heavy shelling. It was, so far as it could be in Sirgirkar, peaceful. "Wonder how bad it's got back behind the wall," Agama said from his place about 15 feet off when he noticed Berani looking his way. The older man drained perhaps half his canteen of burning liquor, and then sidled a bit closer along the wall, saying, "I figure that's why they don't let us go up out back the way we came in. Better that we don't see the city after all this shooting." "Probably right," Berani agreed, turning his gaze back out towards the water. "But it's probably best we don't see it." "We'll be in it before too long," Agama told him. "When they get through the breach they're digging, I mean." "You don't think we'll hold?" "I don't think we will if the first and second couldn't," Agama muttered. "Not forever, anyhow. The real question is whether we can kill enough when they're on the way in that they lose steam taking the city wall by wall, street by street." Agama was beside him now, almost shoulder to shoulder, looking out into the swamp alongside him. Berani could smell the stinging stink of the open beet liquor, but he knew from experience Agama wasn't truly drunk, just satiated, subdued, mellow. "Well, Fort 3 is pretty much rubble by now," Berani said. "Makes me wonder how long they're going to wait to throw men at it." "I wager they're cooking something up. Something clever, knowing them," Agama said. "Best we can do is wait, and hope the scout flights see it early enough to warn us when it comes." Agama offered Berani the canteen of thick red alcohol. Berani took it and, squinting his eyes against the foul taste, downed 2 whole mouthfuls before handing it back to a chuckling Agama. He coughed once. "That is foul," Berani said. "Do you think the Ug's tongues work?" Agama laughed. But before he could answer, the half-registered peripheral sight of Pahala and the other prospective fishermen snapping to attention made him jolt. Almost immediately, before he could react beyond his nervous start, a shape came up on Berani's left. Tall, lean, stern. "Corporal Berani." The familiar voice of Raja Bayani rang far louder than it was in his ears. He straightened up to face his father, trying to keep his beet-stained breath downward as he spoke. "Yes, sir." It was the first time he'd seen his father up close in weeks. They had shared a brief, quiet moment when his father had dropped by to congratulate him on finishing training before they'd boarded the boats north, but the exchange had been distant, almost wordless. Though he'd been glad of his father's approval, however stern, Berani somehow didn't think the Raja would react so well to finding him drinking on watch. "I've already talked with Satria, and all my other officers," Raja Bayani began, taking his time, "but I wanted to speak with you personally." Bayani did not mention the liquor stink. Perhaps that was because, quite obviously, Agama was the source of most of it, and the Raja was willing to forgive the old soldier some of his trespasses. Whatever the case, Berani kept his mouth shut, and kept his still-watering eyes trained on his father's. "Word from the spotters is that the Shaishans are damming up the Usal and Igtuku in the far north," Raja Bayani said. "They mean to divert the rivers, and dry up as much of the field as they can before the attack. They're likely to be finished in the next few days." Agama, still lingering off to the side, let loose something between a cough and a whistle, a noise half jovial and half frightened. Berani, turning to look back out over the moat the northern dredge had become, and the swampy mire beyond, exhaled slow. "That's always been a possibility," Bayani said. "But they moved much, much faster than we anticipated. They've moved a battery out west to begin shelling the west wall where it guards the upper city, another down to hit the south wall, and they've started bombardment of the eastern canal gate, looking to drain the city's waterways once the riverbeds run dry. The Navy is planning a fighting withdrawal down the Usal tonight, before the waters drop too low. They can't risk the flagship and the High Priestess being trapped in the city when the port dries up. The big ships are being stripped of their guns to make sure Sir Girkar has all the firepower it needs." "You think they'll make it?" It was Agama who spoke. Berani lingered in thought a moment before answering. "Who knows? The Sholo Shaishans are doubtless expecting them on the riverbanks, but the Navy has been in worse positions before. I have to think Laut will see them through." Raja Berani shook his head as if to jostle free the doubt in his voice. Then he pushed on. Berani thought in that moment that, despite his mental image of his father as unbreakable and unshakable, the man looked every bit as exhausted as he was. "But I came to talk about something else," Berani said. "The news about the rivers will go out tonight to all the garrison. What concerns me is who the Sholo Shaishans have camped up near the northern battery." "Ektal?" Agama asked. "Some," Berani said. "A few Ektal legions, and around 20 of the regular army. But it's where they're from that concerns me." Agama, staying silent, looked back out over the mud and the pools. "Most of them are flying blue provincial flags below the black and gold," Raja Berani clarified for a confused Berani. "They're from Hurabaya, from Estlan." Berani had never seen his father look so worried. "They'll be the ones they send into the breach up here in the north," Raja Berani said. "I'm sure of it. Berani, I want you to promise me that if things go ill, and we aren't able to fall back to the north wall through the outer fields, and you find yourself surrounded or under fire, you won't surrender. Don't let them take you alive." Berani's head was a whirl with questions, but he could see in the hinted desperation in his father's eyes that this was not the time for them. "I promise, sir," he said. "You can count on me. I'll do what needs to be done, if the time comes." Raja Berani hugged him. It was not warm or long, but it left Berani even more shaken than he'd already been. Then Berani, his task seemingly done, swept on broad and silent stride down the firing line's corridor to Fort Limu, where his quarters awaited him. Agama, quiet at his shoulder, finished the liquor he'd got, and flagged down another passing runner for more in the aftermath. He was the only one of Berani's section who valued the alcohol more than the tobacco. "We're bound for sacrifice if the Shaishans take us anyhow," Berani said after a time. "What's so much worse about the Hurabaya Lautani?" "There's worse things than having your heart carved out quick on Shahwit Zul," Agama said simply. "The Shaishans think you're salvageable, spiritually speaking. They'll treat you with respect. If the end comes, it will happen in the blink of an eye. But our cousins from the continent, not so tame." The landscape before them was almost wholly dark now. The rain was picking up a bit, and the drum of it into the blue brick of the sloped wall before them droned into a constant hum. Agama handed Berani the renewed beet liquor, and Berani again downed several mouthfuls. He did not cough quite so much this time. "In the last war, on the peninsula," Agama said, "we didn't have any real sieges or city fights street to street to speak of. It was all out in the jungle. The Lautani living in Hurabaya city itself were mostly of our faith, and welcomed our ships in with open arms when we came to reinforce them. But the souls of the countryside have belonged to Harakwe for hundreds, in some places thousands, of years. And when we went out into the trees all brave and boisterous to fight the Shaishans, we found they were far worse than any of the dogfolk. I remember," Agama said, staring skyward, "about 2 months in, after a big night raid by the enemy in the Ezo Hills, we found there were about 20 men missing from our platoon's dugouts. But we could hear noises come morning, out in the green, some of ours still alive. Your father was our lieutenant, brave then as he is now, and he led us out into the trees to see if we could get the wounded back. Agama downed the remainder of his drink, a dangerous amount. He swayed heavy on his legs, as if the burn of it going down was soon to topple him. But he righted and spoke on as if no break had been had. And you know, every one of those 20 missing men was still alive, he told Berani. Every last one of them. They were stuck up alive on sharpened bamboo stalks, groin to shoulder. It was almost artful. I figure they ran the things through the prisoners without ever troubling an organ enough to bleed them out too quickly. The ones we took down died when the wounds were opened up. The rest we shot, so they didn't have to hang there like that. It was the local Lautani that did that. They weren't even soldiers, just men from the village west of us who snuck out in the night. And you know what? It was probably our inquisitors back in days of old that taught the rural folk along the border with the Shaishans that trick. Hate of us is bred into them, because for thousands of years we've dealt things worthy of hate back and forth between us. We the Orthodox, and they the heretics. Agama was looking over at Berani now, but Berani was finding it difficult to meet the older man's subtly reddened eyes. The Shaishans want to break us from the Ug and the faith, and bring us back to the fold, so far as they see it, Agama said. The Southland Lautani would kill every one of us, and Laut herself, out of spite, if such a thing were possible. So fight hard, if they're the ones who come against us. And if the time comes to give up your life, make sure you do it certain and sure. You don't want them to find you wounded. Agama didn't walk off or drift away to another part of the line, but stayed silent in the dark beside him, and Berani stared north to the grim horizon through till midnight ended their watch. When he lay down in his cot that night, the guns of the enemy rolling ever on, it was no wonder to him that sleep again eluded him.